What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and this past week we got the much anticipated, albeit early access release of Hades 2, and as always, I've played it and I want to talk about it. So without further ado, let's rock. And since Hades 2, much like the first game, did release first in early access, I do want to point out that this video will only be my first impressions, not my full review. And I know that may sound like a silly distinction to some, but I find it important to point out that even though Hades 2 is way more polished than the early access games I've talked about recently, it's still not the final game. So therefore, I don't feel like this video should be my final thoughts on that game. But before we get into how I felt about the game itself, there is some housekeeping that we have to get into first. Hades 2, of course, is the sequel to the first Hades game, and like the first game, it is also a roguelike action RPG. It was released in early access on May 6th. Hades 2 was developed and published by Supergiant Games, the studio that, of course, made the first game, among others. Set sometime after the first game, Hades 2 follows Melano, princess of the underworld and sister to Zag, the protagonist from the first game, who looks to defeat the Titan of Time, Kronos. Since it was released in early access, Hades 2 is currently only available on PC via Steam and the Epic Games Store. But Supergiant does have plans to bring the game to consoles eventually. According to the game's roadmap, Hades 2 will be in early access through the end of 2024. If the sequel follows the same timeline as the first game, the earliest we could see Hades 2 on consoles would be late 2025, early 2026. And speaking of the original game, I was definitely late to the party when it came to Hades. Despite the universal acclaim, I was really hesitant to play the first game. Despite everyone telling me how great it was, I just don't really like the top-down action RPG style. I've talked about that on past videos. It's just really not my cup of tea. But I did finally break down and I played the game for the first time last year because I wanted to give it a shot before the second one came out. And no surprise, I thought it was great. I loved the style despite not being a fan of those games generally. I thought the style was great. I loved the personality, and I was not going to make the same mistake twice. I was going to play the sequel the first opportunity I got. And I've talked about this on previous reviews when it comes to sequels and what I expect from said sequels. If I played the first game and I'm playing its sequel, 99% of the time it's because I really liked the first game, and that's definitely the case for the first Hades. The style and personality I really enjoyed, but of course the live, die, repeat aspect was also really cool. I loved tweaking my build to get better each run. That was a lot of fun, and I did not, I promise you, mean for that to rhyme. So going into the sequel, I just kind of wanted more of that, and that's kind of my expectation for all video game sequels, is give me more of what I wanted or I liked from the first game with slight improvements along the way, so it doesn't feel stale. Again, this sequel is still officially in early access, so you definitely need to grade on that curve, so I wasn't expecting a ton of new improvements. But like I said earlier, I was late to the Hades party. Didn't play it until last year, so obviously I missed it while it was in early access. So my only experience with an early access Supergiant game release is with this one, Hades 2. And coincidentally, I have played several early access games this year, which is not something I do very often. I don't usually play that many early access games. I usually just wait for them to be the full release. But all three games, early access games that I've played this year, Palworld, No Rest for the Wicked, and now Hades 2, I've actually discussed on this channel. The previous two, Palworld and No Rest for the Wicked, had some serious issues that definitely needed to be cleaned up, and I talked about that in those videos. Hades 2, on the other hand, doesn't feel like those games. It doesn't feel like a game you would expect from an early access release. This game absolutely rules. It's beautiful, it's difficult, but not insane, so it doesn't feel like you're getting punished run after run. And most importantly, it is very, very addicting. Outside of seeing the new Planet of the Apes movie at the drive-in, Hades 2 is all I did this past weekend. I played Hades 2 a lot on my Steam Deck, more on that later. And when that died, my Steam Deck died, I moved the fun to my gaming PC. And it was basically rinse and repeat all weekend, much to the dismay of my wife. She was not very happy. I did not get a lot of stuff done around the house, but I was playing a ton of Hades 2, and it did everything I wanted from a sequel. Actually not going to spend too much time discussing the story. As I've said already, feels like a million times at this point. This game is still in early access, and at this point there isn't a true ending to the story yet. It's actually one of my few gripes about this game still in early access, is the fact that we don't have a true ending yet. Like I mentioned earlier, you do play as a brand new main character, Melano, who is Zag's sister, Zag being the main character of the first game. Melano was raised by the headmistress Hecate, and she is out for revenge. And that's basically all I'll say about the story. As a character, I don't love Melano's personality. She's not quite as fun and funny as Zag was in the first game. She's much more uptight and proper. She does kind of have this weird dynamic with another character named Nemesis. She kind of plays that hall monitor type of character. So Nemesis is always leaving her post, and she's very envious of Melano being able to do this mission, basically being picked to do this mission. And so there's definitely a weird dynamic between the two characters, and Melano is kind of uptight and proper and wants to follow all the rules. She wants to cross all of her T's and dot all of her I's, and therefore she just doesn't have that fun personality that Zag had in the first game. Therefore, the game itself isn't as funny as I thought it was going to be. It's definitely not as funny as the first game. Now, there are certain characters like a shade named Dora that you come across in the Crossroads that does pick up the slack as far as the humor is concerned, but there's definitely not as much of that in the second game as it was in the first game. I will say that there's some really interesting elements to the character. Melano not really having the confidence that she's the right person for this mission. She definitely kind of wavers at times with that, so I thought that that was really interesting. And then of course I love how the story unfolds. If you've played the first Hades game, which I would suggest if you're going to play this one, you will feel right at home with the style of the story of Hades 2. And the same can be said for the most part about the gameplay. Mel is a witch, so she does cast spells. You cast her spells by using a finite resource called mana. Once you run out of mana, you are left with just her basic attacks. Of course, there are plenty ways to replenish mana, but it is something that you will need to manage. You will definitely want to make sure that you've got plenty of mana, because the biggest change from the first Hades game is the addition of the Omega attacks in its sequel. Basically, they're souped up versions of a charged attack. All you have to do to pull off an Omega attack is just to hold down the input for your attack, special, or cast, and you will perform an Omega version of that attack. And those Omega attacks can be upgraded using boons or hammers. Those attacks do cost mana, so you will need to learn very quickly how to manage that resource. Not only does Mel cast spells, but she also has different weapons as well. Since the weapons are different than the original, OG Hades players will need a moment to adjust. Rest assured that there is a training area to practice in. All the weapons that are currently available are pretty easy to unlock by farming for resources. You farm those resources by using the corresponding tool that also needs to be unlocked. Unfortunately, this is another gripe that I have with the early access release of Hades 2, is you can only carry one tool at a time, which gets annoying and is something that I'm hoping that they will fix moving forward. And I get it. I get that the game is built around playing the game multiple times, but it is pretty deflating to pass by a resource just because you decided on a different tool this run. Those materials that you farm that are used to unlock weapons can also be used for incantations at the Crossroads, but we'll talk more about the Crossroads here in a little bit. I really enjoyed how the different weapons made the game play different, and it felt like my decisions therefore on like upgrades and stuff like that mean much more. If I was gonna go aggressive and choose the axe, I wanted to make sure I had upgrades that were gonna do more damage, while if I was gonna cast more spells, I needed to make sure I had something to replenish my mana, and so on and so forth. There's also a sprint in Hades 2, which really adds some depth to the gameplay, and I know it doesn't sound like much, but there are boons to upgrade your sprint where you can literally start doing damage by just sprinting past enemies, which I thought was really cool because it basically takes a mechanic that would be mostly a defensive measure in most games, and it can actually make it an offensive one in Hades 2. There are also these, what I'm going to call tarot cards, because that's what they kind of look like, but I don't know if they have an actual name in the game. If they do, I missed it. But basically, these cards grant Mel extremely useful upgrades. However, you are limited to the amount of cards you can equip by what they call your grasp. Each card has a grasp cost. The higher Mel's grasp limit, the more cards you can equip. Therefore, I would really suggest farming the material called Psyche as quickly as possible, as early as possible, because that's what you use to upgrade your grasps. And these tarot cards are super, super useful. So the more that you can equip, the better. And I've already mentioned the Crossroads, which is basically this game's hub. If you played the first Hades game, the Crossroads functions basically exactly like the House of Hades did in the first game. At the Crossroads, you can do a bunch of stuff. You can brew incantations, swap out weapons, talk to NPCs, and so much more. Much like the first game, the NPCs aren't always there. Certain NPCs seem to rotate on different runs, which I definitely appreciated. I liked it in the first game, and I definitely liked that it followed through in the second game. It makes it feel like a living world and not just a video game. Because if an NPC is always going to be at the exact same spot every time you come back there, it feels like you're playing a video game, which of course we are. But when they're not always there and they've kind of wandered off and are doing their own thing, it definitely feels much more like a living world. I know it's a small thing, but I really, really dug it. I also love that you can, like in the first game, give them gifts to earn keepsakes. Those keepsakes are also not quite as useful as the cards, but they do give you some really cool upgrades, so that's always awesome. And then if you continue to talk to the different NPCs, it does unlock different dialogue trees. And much like the first game, Hades 2's combat is built on a lot of trial and error. The live, die, repeat core gameplay of the first game is of course a key feature of the sequel as well. Just like the first game, that repetitive nature of the gameplay can become stale to some, but I am not one of those people. Like I said earlier, I am addicted to this game right now. As soon as I died, I just wanted to jump right back into it again. And my goal was, as it was in the first game when I played it, just working to get a little bit further every single time. And I never really got bored with that. It certainly helps that there is enough enemy variety in each area, plus not every area is exactly the same as the run previous, so they definitely change it up on you. Also, there are characters that will interrupt your runs from time to time. I've already mentioned Nemesis. Well, she will drop in every so often to challenge you, or Artemis will come out of nowhere to assist you in an area, and that keeps every run feeling fresh. There is also a bit of RNG to Hades 2, which normally I would complain about, but in this particular case, I don't mind it because it makes every run feel unique. Every run you get a different opportunity for a different boon, and those boons will drastically change your run. However, in most games, there are obvious advantages and disadvantages to the certain upgrades. In Hades 2, I do think that they're balanced fairly well. Of course, some are better than others. I'm not going to sit here and say they're all balanced equally. There are some that I prefer over others. However, I never really felt like I was doomed because I didn't get a certain upgrade. Most of my runs were ruined by me being bad at the game or being too aggressive or something like that, not because I didn't have the right upgrade equipped. And it certainly doesn't hurt the replayability of Hades 2 that the music, sound design, and art style were impeccable. The voice acting in this game, like the original, is top notch. Fans of Baldur's Gate 3 will be pleasantly surprised. There is a familiar voice in Hades 2. I was a big fan of that. The soundtrack, which I mentioned a couple of weeks ago when I was playing No Rest for the Wicked, that I ended up just turning on Spotify and listening to a playlist on my own because there really wasn't a ton of music in that game, and I was kind of bummed by that. However, in Hades 2, there's absolutely no need to do that. It has another great soundtrack by Darren Kerb. There's literally a boss fight that plays out like a rock show, and that song absolutely slaps. It's easily my favorite boss battle. I think I might be too old to say the word slaps. The art style is for the most part unchanged, which is good because the art style in the first game was awesome. I will say that, and maybe this is recency bias, I don't know, but I personally prefer the look of Hades 2 more than the first game. And honestly, it's kind of hard to put my finger on why, so maybe it is recency bias. Maybe it's just because Supergiant has had a few years to fine tune some stuff with the art style, so maybe that's why it looks a little bit nicer to me. But I was absolutely blown away by how good this game looks, especially considering how I expected it to look great, because that is one of the things I adored about the first game. So I had already high expectations for how this game was going to look, and they managed to exceed those expectations. It was one of the few early access elements outside of the unfinished story that was a little bit of a bummer, was the fact that there was some placeholder art. So most of this game looks amazing, like I just said, but there are some things that they just put placeholder art instead of the actual final art. I'm sure that that's going to be added soon, that they're going to fix that soon, but that was a little bit of a bummer just because I dug the art style for this game so much. Speaking of early access, there is a roadmap easily accessible on the game's title screen that does mention what is coming soon for Hades 2. Among other things, they are currently working on another region, a new weapon, and cosmetic items for the Crossroads. And lastly, I did mention during my discussion of the early access release of No Rest for the Wicked that anytime that I buy a game on PC, I always want to try it on my Steam Deck. But in the case of No Rest for the Wicked, I didn't even bother because it performed so poorly on my actual gaming PC that I just knew it wouldn't run well on my Steam Deck. Luckily, it was the exact opposite for Hades 2. This game fucking rules on the Steam Deck. It's one of the rare games, kind of like Vampire Survivors, that I actually prefer to play on my Steam Deck. I can just chill on my couch with my pups, put on the Pittsburgh Pirates game while I play Hades 2 on my Steam Deck, and I'm living my best life. Except for the fact that the Pirates aren't very good, so that kind of sucks. And maybe this says a lot more about game releases in 2024, but this early access Hades 2 build, you could have told me that it was the full final release, and I still would have been pleased despite the few early access warts it did have. This game absolutely rules. The art style, which is basically unchanged from the first game, is, despite that, slightly better, at least in my opinion. The soundtrack is an absolute banger. Now, Mel doesn't quite have the same personality as Zag. She's not quite as funny, but other characters pick up the slack in that department, and I did find that I grew to love her in just a different way, so that's great. They did add enough to the combat that makes this game feel a lot different than the original. It doesn't feel like a glorified expansion of the original, so that's great. That's exactly what I want from a sequel. And while I don't give official star ratings to early access games, not that it really matters, my star rating isn't gonna move the needle one way or the other, I do kind of want to give you guys an idea of where my head's at with this game as it currently stands. I think if push came to shove, I would give this game 4 stars. I was leaning very heavily to 4.5, but there are a few things that are missing from this game that need to be added. So if they do add those things, by the end of the year, it could be 4.5 stars, and it could be in contention for my game of the year if it becomes a full game. If it's not in early access by the end of 2024, I definitely could see this game being in contention for my game of the year. That's how much I enjoyed it. As always, those are just my thoughts on Hades 2. I'd love to hear yours in the comments down below. Of course, I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash that like button, as the kids say. It's just a quick and easy way to tell YouTube that you enjoyed the video, and they should push it to other people that enjoy this type of content as well. If you did enjoy this video, definitely consider subscribing. And if you do subscribe, ding that bell. That way you get notified every time I post another video. I try to post weekly gaming related content. So if you like that type of content, which you obviously did, you've made it this far in the video, consider subscribing and ding that bell. But until next video, take it easy. What's up, YouTube people? It's your boy Patty McNinja, and this is my boy Yoshi, aka Kitty Boy. And we were just talking, and we agree that since you made it this far in the video, you might as well subscribe. You wouldn't want to disappoint Kitty Boy, would you?